Welcome to TM News. Ukraine invasion could cause global food crisis. UN warns Russia's invasion of Ukraine could soon cause a global food crisis that may last for years, the UN has warned. Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said the war had worsened food insecurity in poorer nations due to rising prices. Some countries could face long-term famines if Ukraine's exports are not restored to pre-war levels, he added. The conflict has cut off supplies from Ukraine's ports, which once exported vast amounts of cooking oil as well as cereals such as maize and wheat. This has reduced the global supply and caused the price of alternatives to soar. Global food prices are almost 30% higher than the same time last year, according to the UN. Speaking in New York on Wednesday, Mr. Guterres said the conflict, combined with the effects of climate change and the pandemic, threatens to tip tens of millions of people over the edge into food insecurity followed by malnutrition, mass hunger, and famine. There is enough food in our world now if we act together. But unless we solve this problem today, we face the specter of global food shortage in the coming months, he added. He warned that the only effective solution to the crisis was reintegrating Ukraine's food production, as well as fertilizer produced by both Russia and Belarus, back into the global market. War in Ukraine, more coverage. Mr. Guterres also said he was in intense contact with Russia and Ukraine, as well as the US and the EU, in an effort to restore food exports to normal levels. The complex security, economic and financial implications require goodwill on all sides, he said. His comments came on the same day the World Bank announced extra funding worth $12 billion for projects addressing food insecurity. The move will bring the total amount available for such projects to more than $30 billion over the next 15 months. Russia and Ukraine produce 30% of the world's wheat supply and, prior to the war, Ukraine was seen as the world's breadbasket, exporting 4.5 million tons of agricultural produce per month through its ports. But since Russia launched its invasion in February, exports have collapsed and prices have skyrocketed. They climbed even further after India banned wheat exports on Saturday. The UN says around 20 million tons of grain are currently stuck in Ukraine from the previous harvest which, if released, could ease pressure on global markets. While the number of people facing food insecurity had been growing even before the invasion, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock accused Moscow of making a difficult situation even worse on Wednesday. Russia has launched a grain war, stoking a global food crisis, Berlin's top diplomat said. It is doing so at a time when millions are already being threatened by hunger, particularly in the Middle East and Africa. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the world faced the greatest global food security crisis of our time, which had been exacerbated by what he called Russian President Vladimir Putin's war of choice. Ukraine war, Russia's invasion not going to plan. NATO says NATO's Secretary-General says Russia's war in Ukraine is not going to plan and that its attempt to capture the eastern Donbas region has stalled. Jens Stoltenberg also said Ukraine could win the conflict. Britain's Ministry of Defense estimates Russia has lost about a third of its ground combat force since the war began in February. The Russian invasion has been hampered by stiff Ukrainian resistance and logistical issues. Its initial goal appeared to be to sweep across the country and topple the Ukrainian government. Instead, Russia has withdrawn from areas around the capital Kiev after failing to capture it and since mid-April has been focusing its efforts on two eastern provinces. In Ukraine's second city of Kharkiv, officials say Russian forces have withdrawn from to the border and that residents were returning. Russia's war in Ukraine is not going as Moscow had planned, said Mr. Stoltenberg. They failed to take Kiev, they are pulling back from around Kharkiv, their major offensive in Donbas has stalled. Russia is not achieving its strategic objectives. Mr. Stoltenberg was speaking at a meeting of NATO foreign ministers. On top of the military setbacks, another consequence of the invasion is that Russia will likely face an expanded NATO with Sweden and Finland set to join. Russia's President Vladimir Putin sees NATO as a security threat to Russia and invaded Ukraine in part to stop it joining NATO. In its assessment, The MOD's estimate of Russia's losses cover men killed or wounded and equipment destroyed or captured. The MOD said Russia's Donbass offensive had lost momentum and fallen significantly behind schedule. It said Russia was constrained by continued low morale and reduced combat effectiveness. The British Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, said Ukraine's allies must keep up their military support to help it push Russia out. On the ground, Ukrainian forces are counterattacking in the city of Izium, Regional Governor Olesina Gubov said, something that could complicate Russian plans to capture the Donbass. However, Ukraine's military also acknowledged setbacks in its latest updates, saying Russia was advancing in several areas in the region. There has been no let-up for the remaining Ukrainian forces in Mariupol, with Russia continuing its bombardment of the steelworks where they are holed up. Video purportedly from inside showed men checking their phones and playing chess. And in western Ukraine, the governor of the Lviv region said missiles had targeted military infrastructure. Ukraine conflict. Russian chemical attack claim fact-checked. Russia is using a familiar tactic to blame an adversary for attacks it has not carried out, on this occasion accusing Ukrainian forces of blowing up a fertilizer storage facility. The purpose of the attack, says Russia's defense ministry, was so that the Ukrainians could then accuse Russian forces of having launched a chemical weapons attack. Russia also claims that the Ukrainian security forces have attempted to set up a second false flag event, by appealing for bodies to be used to simulate a Russian air attack. There's no evidence that either of these claims is true. What are false flag attacks? Moscow has a history of falsely accusing its opponents of staging provocations, which either never happened at all, or were subsequently carried out by themselves or their allies. What has Moscow said? A Russian Ministry of Defense briefing on May 11 asserted that Ukrainian forces had carried out an explosion of a tanker with fertilizer, presumably ammonium nitrate, which resulted in a cloud of orange smoke that dissipated after some time. According to Moscow, the aim of the explosion, which occurred in the Kharkiv region, was to accuse Russia of using chemical weapons in order to extract additional military aid from the West by the Kiev regime. No evidence was given in support of the claim that Ukrainian forces were responsible for the explosion. What we know about the incident: the location in a video showing the plumes of orange smoke rising into the sky was identified using satellite imagery as Dolzhenkoy, an agricultural region near the city of Kharkiv. One Ukrainian media outlet quoted reports on Telegram that the cloud of smoke formed after a Russian drone hit an object. Following the explosion, Oleksiy Arestovych, an advisor to the head of the Ukrainian president's office, said he did not believe it was a Russian chemical weapon attack, although he did add the qualification that he would have to clarify such preliminary data. The BBC was unable to find evidence of Ukrainian officials subsequently accusing Russia of using chemical weapons in this incident. Video and satellite imagery showing the farm buildings hit are consistent with an explosion where facilities containing ammonium nitrate have been set on fire, releasing a characteristic orange-colored cloud, says Wim Zwijnenberg, an arms researcher at PAX, a Dutch humanitarian organization. Mr. Zwijnenberg says up to 40 similar agricultural facilities have been destroyed in Ukraine since the start of the Russian invasion in February. In recent weeks, Dolzhenkoy has been the target of shelling from Russian forces, with satellite imagery showing various fields in the area scarred by shelling. Other recent Russian false flag claims: Operation Z, a pro-Russian social media channel with almost 800,000 subscribers, recently claimed doctors in Ukraine had been instructed to take the bodies of women and children to a hospital, from where they would be transported to one of the social facilities in the city where an air raid allegedly by Russian aviation will be simulated. The Telegram post on May 12 said, Ukrainian special services are preparing a provocation in the Dnieper region to accuse the Russian military of killing civilians. There is no evidence for this narrative, which follows other similar claims by pro-Russian media. In early April, the Russian Ministry of Defense said UK intelligence operatives were putting civilian bodies in basements in the Sumy region, who could then be portrayed in the West as victims of a Russian massacre. Again, there's no evidence that this happened. Russia has a history of accusing its enemies of staging what it calls provocations, by which it means attacks that can be blamed on Russia. In some cases the claims are to cover for attacks committed by Russia or its proxies, in others the claims refer to future events that might not happen at all. During the Syrian conflict, Moscow repeatedly accused the White Helmet Civil Defense Group, the UK, the US, France and Belgium of preparing chemical attacks that they could then blame on Russia and Syria. However, inquiries into chemical attacks during the war have concluded that the Syrian government was responsible for the attacks on Douma and Ghouta. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, the BBC reported on a number of false flag events, including claims that a burned-out and bullet-ridden car was evidence of Ukrainian attacks on citizens. However, closer inspection of the Russian separatists' own photos of the incident revealed that the bodies inside had surgical incisions consistent with being recently cut open for post-mortem examination, and were already dead at the time of the alleged attack.